Welcome back to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic. It's EDH Commander Thursday, and today we are going to continue our build-around series, Lazav Dimir Mastermind, selected and chosen by the MTG Burgeoning community for an EDH Commander mill deck. What's up, MTG Burgeoning community? Here we are with another episode of our Build Around series, and today we are going to continue our build with Lazav the Dimir Mastermind. If you missed any of the previous episodes of this deck building series, you can click a link in the description below and bring you right up to speed. Briefly, these were the first 12 cards added to this Dimir Mill deck. And for the purposes of clarity and specificity, the first 12 cards that were added were grouped together to be themed around a global way to mill all opponents at the table. So these are not opponent-specific spells. These are spells that we want to use to mill all opponents that are sitting at the EDH table. And those first 12 cards are Altar of the Brood, Ruin Crab, Maddening Cacophony, Folio of Fancies, Manic Scribe, Mind Crank, King Narfi's Betrayal, Psychic Corrosion, Memory Erosion, Court of Cunning, Consuming Aberration, Mind Grind. Those were the first 12 cards added to this Dimir mill deck. Now the next 12 cards that we're going to add still have the mill theme. However, these 12 cards are going to focus on milling target opponent versus global mill that we saw with the first 12 cards added. So let's begin with one copy of a Tempest favorite, your favorite and mine, Altar of Dementia. It's an artifact that has a mana value of 2. We sacrifice a creature, and target player puts a number of cards equal to that creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. Yes, this artifact does read target player, but very rarely are we going to choose to mill ourselves, because Lazav does not trigger when cards that we have go into the graveyard. It's only for our opponents. So we should really read Altar of Dementia as target opponent puts a number of cards equal to the creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. And as you saw with at least one of the creatures, the Consuming Aberration, without the potential automatic shuffle effects of any of the Eldrazi Titans, that creature paired with Altar of Dementia could be a win condition. Card number 1 in this subset of target opponent is Altar of Dementia. Card number 2, we are going to play with a copy of Thief of Sanity. 1 blue and a black, it's a 2/2 flying specter, and whenever Thief of Sanity deals combat damage to a player, we look at the top 3 cards of that player's library. We exile 1 face down, and then put the other cards into their graveyard. For as long as that card remains exiled, we may look at it, we may cast it, and we may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. More importantly, we get to be very selective with which cards go to the graveyard. With Lazav in play, Thief of Sanity can allow us to look at the top 3 cards of that library and choose to put one of those so tantalizing creatures into the graveyard, allowing Lazav to shift his shape and become a copy of that creature. So Thief of Sanity, not only with the evasion, can do a little pinging damage here, pinging damage there with some smaller combat. It more importantly allows us to cast a spell that we can put into exile, of course, but it also gives us the, ability to be a little selective as to what goes to the graveyard. Thief of Sanity is card number 2. Next up, we're going to shift gears from artifact to creature to enchantment with a copy of Sphinx's Tutelage. 2 and a blue. Whenever we draw a card, target opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. If they're both non-land cards that share a color, repeat this process. That in and of itself is a valuable enough enchantment to include in this deck. Even the ability of 5 and a blue to draw a card, then discard a card, that, I mean, I guess we could consider that to be a late game mana sink. I would like to think we can find a better way to utilize 6 overall mana. So maybe we just kind of disregard the bottom ability of this enchantment. However, every time we draw a card, we're milling minimally an opponent for 2. Sphinx's Tutelage is going to be a sneaky card out there on the battlefield because it's not going to have the glitz and glamour saying to our opponents, you must remove us, you must remove us. No. It's probably going to stay on the battlefield for the entirety of the game. Staying in theme with both enchantment and tutelage, we have a copy of Teferi's Tutelage, 2 and a blue for another enchantment, and when Teferi's Tutelage enters the battlefield, we draw a card and then discard a card. And again, whenever we draw a card, target opponent mills 2 cards. So it's not exactly the same as what Sphinx's Tutelage does, because as it ETBs, it draws us a card, as opposed to us needing to tap 6 in order to draw a card off of Sphinx's Tutelage. However, with Sphinx's Tutelage, we have the propensity of repeating the mill process if an opponent has 2 non-land cards that share a color. Teferi's Tutelage does not do that for us. However, it does allow us to draw a card and discard a card. This looting effect attached to the enchantment's ETB also will allow an opponent to mill 2 cards because it will be in play when it triggers. Teferi's Tutelage is card number 4 of this subset of 12. 1/3 of the way through, and the next opponent-specific spell that we're going to include in this mill deck is going to be a copy of Mind Funeral. 1 blue and a black. Target opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until 4 land cards are revealed, and then that player puts all cards revealed this way into their graveyard. Yes, please continue to use your fetch lands to thin out your deck. Please continue to crack, recur, and utilize those Evolving Wilds, Fabled Passages, Prismatic Vistas, and Terramorphic Expanses. That will only allow the Mind Funeral to get more cards from the library into your graveyard, giving Lazav a buffet of choices. Mind Funeral, powerful spell for a mana value of 3. Next card up, we're going back to our blue enchantments, but this time we're skipping the uncommon and going right to rare for a copy of Fraying Sanity. 2 and a blue, this enchantment as an Aura Curse enchants a player, and at the beginning of each end step, enchanted player puts the top X cards of their library into their graveyard, where X is the number of cards put into the graveyard from anywhere that turn. So think about that. Discard, mill, spells that are being cast, permanents that are leaving the battlefield and going to the graveyard. I can attest that Fraying Sanity's ability can get completely out of control for whichever poor opponent is going to be cursed with this aura. Again, this is not going to be a good card for us because Lazav does not trigger for cards for our cards. This is for our opponents. So we definitely slap this on the player that's playing with a creature-heavy deck, and we just watch all of the options just fly right into the graveyard. All right, as we complete the halfway point of this subset of 12 cards, here's number 7, and we're going to one of my personal favorite sets, Shadows over Innistrad. Here is 1 copy of Startled Awake. 2 and 2 blue for a sorcery. Target opponent puts the top 13 cards of their library into the graveyard. That's pretty good. 4 for 13. That is pretty sweet. The next ability, 3 and 2 blue, we can put Startle Awake from our graveyard onto the battlefield, transformed. We can only activate this ability anytime we could cast a sorcery. So what is the transformed version of Startle Awake? It is Persistent Nightmare, a 1/1 nightmare creature with the Skulk mechanic. Very, very underrated and powerful mechanic this is. Skulk, for anyone who's unfamiliar with it, means that this creature can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. So if there is a an opponent with a board full of 2 power plus creatures, Persistent Nightmare is going to slip right by, deal combat damage, and when it does, we return it to our hand. When Persistent Nightmare deals this combat damage, it returns to our hand, allowing us to once again cast Startle Awake. For another 4 mana, that's 13 more cards from the top of someone's library right into the graveyard. And then we can continue to repeat this process for as many times as we need until we can find a suitable shape for Lazav to shift into. That is number 7. Number 8, we're going to a gold creature similar to Thief of Sanity, but packs a greater punch, and that's going to be Nemesis of Reason. 3 blue and a black for a 3/7 Leviathan Horror. Whenever Nemesis of Reason attacks, defending player puts the top 10 cards of their library into their graveyard. Now, a toughness of 7 is really beefy enough in order to send this creature into combat with little fear of it dying from combat damage, aside from numerous creatures chump blocking it to death. And notice it doesn't have to deal damage in order for its mill ability to trigger. Whenever it's declared as an attacker, whoever it's attacking is putting 10 cards from the top of their library right into their graveyard. Lazav will appreciate you, Nemesis of Reason. All right, and we're down to our last 3 or 4 cards here. Here is another gold card that's going to help with the milling, and that is Mirrodin, Mind Drinker. 3 blue and a black, so a mana value identical to Nemesis of Reason. However, we have some evasion here on this legendary vampire. It's a 2/4 flyer. It has to deal combat damage in order to trigger its mill, but when it does, it's a Mind Funeral on a stick. Whenever Mirrodin deals combat damage to a player, that player reveals cards from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals 4 land cards, then puts all cards revealed into their graveyard. Mirrodin is a walking Mind Funeral, and that 2/4 flying evasion is going to do a lot of heavy lifting in this Dimir mill deck. Next card, as we're down to our last 3, we got number 10, 11, and 12. We're going to War of the Spark, and we're going to include a copy of Enter the God Eternals. For 2 blue and a black, we have a sorcery that reads, Enter the God Eternals deals 4 damage to target creature, and we gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. Target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, and we amass 4. So this is really 4 spells in one if we really want to separate it based upon its overall ability and what it does. First, we're getting rid of a creature. 4 damage to a creature. That's substantial, especially in blue-black. I mean, Dimir doesn't usually do direct damage to creatures. So there's ability number 1. Ability number 2, we're going to gain 4 life. So that's going to be another ability that, let's face it, blue-black doesn't usually gain us life. Next, we're going to have some player, most likely an opponent, as mentioned earlier. They're milling the top 4 cards of their library, and we're creating a 4/4. I'm sorry, that's incorrect. We are creating a zombie army creature token and putting 4 +1/+1 counters on it. So we're getting 4 abilities for a mana value of 5, all of which is very relevant for what we're doing in this deck. Enter the God Eternals is going to be a very, very sneaky and powerful card in this deck, just based upon its versatility. 2 cards left, and if we're playing a mill deck, we cannot proceed with completing the 99 of the deck without including at least a Traumatize. 3 and 2 blue, target player puts the half. Sorry, let's say that again so it makes sense. Target player puts the top half of their library, rounded down, into their graveyard. So let's just look at this card for a second. So if a player is sitting there with 80 cards in their deck, 40 is going into the graveyard. Lazav has got to find something for 40 cards. However, if we just slide Traumatize to the right a little bit, exposing Fraying in the Fraying Sanity enchantment that we talked about earlier, if we can hit an opponent with a Traumatize and we have an even number of cards in their deck and they are cursed by that aura, then we pretty much deck them. We Traumatize for the first half, then at the end step, Fraying Sanity triggers, and then they get decked for the other half. Traumatize could be considered a win condition in this Dimir Mill deck. All right, last card up, and it may be a little bit stepping outside of what we want to do, particularly with this subset of cards, as we have to do something in order to get our targeted milling, but I think it's valuable enough to include. I think it's valuable enough to bend the rules a little bit, and that's going to be one copy of Geth, Lord of the Vault. 4 and 2 black, it's a 5/5 zombie with Intimidate. And that means that it can only be blocked by creatures that share a color with it, as well as artifact creatures. So for his ability, it's X and a black, and we do not have to tap Geth to do this, so we can activate his ability as soon as it enters the battlefield. X and a black allows us to put target artifact or creature card with converted mana cost X from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under our control and tapped. Then that player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So as long as there is an artifact or creature card in an opponent's graveyard and we have the mana to match its mana value, we can just straight gank that artifact or creature, put it into play under our control. It is tapped, but that's fine. And then we get to mill whatever X was. So I do think Geth presents enough value here to be included in this second subset of opponent-dependent mill spells. All right, MTG Burgeoning community, that is the second dozen cards added to our Dimir Mill deck. Next up, since we're building a Dimir deck, we want to start taking advantage of all of these sweet, sweet cards that are going to be so plentiful in our opponent's graveyards. So let's start kicking around some ideas for some spells that we can include that take advantage of all of these potential resources just brimming with hope, stashed away, buried away in all of our opponent's graveyards. Leave me any comments or suggestions for cards you can think of in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.